ARK is a resource providing access to social and political information in Northern Ireland. It was set up with the aim of trying to facilitate public debate and influence policy making and provide access to information on Northern Ireland. ARK's joint between the University of Ulster and Queen's University Belfast, and some of my colleagues are here with us today. The seminar series was set up as a way of bringing people from a whole range of different sectors together to discuss some of the important issues of the day in Northern Ireland. Sometimes we are referring to materials that have been generated within ARK itself through some of the surveys that we run, and other times we use the seminar series as a platform for other interesting research that's gone on in Northern Ireland and relevant to Northern Ireland, so that we can hopefully further help with the dissemination of research from other organisations and so on. And in this case today, we're absolutely delighted that the Northern Ireland Childminding Association, NICVA, and I'm sorry, your Director, Bridget Nodder, is here to introduce work that they've commissioned and that Liz Fawcett from Liz Fawcett Consulting has carried out, looking at Childcare Matters in Northern Ireland. So we're absolutely delighted. Bridget's going to chair the session, which will take the usual format. Liz will speak for about half an hour, and then we'll have some questions and answers, and that'll be followed by a light lunch outside, where you're welcome to ask any other questions or add anything else to the debate that you want. But for now, I'll hand you over to Bridget, who's going to chair the session this morning. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. As Gillian said, my name is Bridget Nodder, and I'm Director of NICVA, the Childminding Association. And although this is a double act, Liz is actually going to do most of the work. So I'm really just introducing myself, Liz, a bit of background as to why we commissioned this piece of research, and then, as Gillian said, I'm chairing the Q&A session afterwards, if anybody does have any questions. So really just to give you a bit of background before I hand over to Liz, as an organisation, we're a regional charity and a membership organisation which works right across Northern Ireland to promote and to develop good quality childminding services. We've been established for 25 years, and I suppose our role is quite diverse. We provide obviously a whole range of services to childminders who are our members, and that can include things like training, quality initiatives, support, information advice, and so on. But increasingly we've done a lot of work in terms of really influencing and developing policy with all of the stakeholders, obviously including all of the government departments. And that's been a role that we've really worked on over the last year and a half, to develop what the issues are facing the childminding sector, to look at solutions and to work with those stakeholders in terms of taking those issues forward. So this piece of work, Childcare Matters, what the public thinks about childcare in Northern Ireland, was really one of the first pieces of research that we looked at. And I suppose it was twofold in the fact that we needed to do something about addressing what we see as fairly negative perceptions of childminding amongst the general public. And I suppose that was anecdotal in the past. But in order to counteract those negative perceptions, we felt the need to get some real robust data in terms of what the public thought about childcare, what they thought specifically about childminding, and also what they thought about NICVA as an organisation supporting the childminding sector. So that was the rationale behind the piece of research. And we then commissioned Liz Fawcett Consultant to develop the research study and to pull a piece of research, to pull the report together. And that's what she's going to present to you today. So I hope you find it interesting. There's a lot of good data in there that has been very useful for us as an organisation and for our work with stakeholders, and certainly for the future work that we do within Northern Ireland. So if you do have any questions, we'd be very happy to take those at the end of the presentation. So I'll hand over to Liz here.
Thank you, Bridget, and thanks very much indeed to Gillian and to the team at ARK for inviting me along today to present the results of this research. I just want to say first of all that you have the research update, which provides a summary of some of the key results, but there is also this report which has been published by NICVA, and copies of that and some other NICVA literature are at the table here if you want to take a copy of any of those before you go away. So just to introduce myself very briefly, I'm, as Bridget said, Liz Fawcett. I run a consultancy which basically specialises in policy development and policy-related research, along with public relations and public affairs. I've had a particular interest in childcare for some time now, so I was delighted when NICVA asked me to take on really two elements of this research, which were the design of the research and then the data analysis and the writing up of the report. So what I'm going to do is just to present some key findings from the survey. But first of all, I'm going to give you a little bit of background to this particular piece of research, just look very briefly at the design, and then go on to look at the key findings really under three headings: the public's views on childcare policy, the public image of childcare in Northern Ireland, the way that parents search for and use childcare, and then we'll just sort of conclude with a summary of some of the key points and some concluding comments. So first of all, if we start off by looking at the background to the whole thing, I'm sure many of you here will be aware that childcare policy in Great Britain and the Republic of Ireland has to date had a much higher profile than it has in Northern Ireland. For example, in England, some of you may be aware that the UK government is investing £4 billion over 3 years in funding for childcare-related type projects that include Sure Start and early years and specific childcare provision. The Irish government is spending at the moment €575 million in its current 5-year national childcare investment programme. That's designed to create up to 50,000 new childcare places. Now, in Northern Ireland to date, there's been no comparable level of public investment in childcare, although OFM, DFM is at the moment actively looking at this area, so watch this space. Things may change on that front. But it's certainly an area that NICVA was very keen to highlight further, because the UK government a few years ago did actually commit itself to the delivery of affordable, high-quality childcare places for all families who require such provision. Now, at the time that that was made, I think that was around about 2004, that commitment, it was meant to extend right across the UK, but to date, in terms of actual Northern Ireland executive policy in Northern Ireland, we don't have a similar commitment from the executive. Whether or not that will change in the future does, as I say, remain to be seen. In terms of government involvement in Northern Ireland in childcare, one of the most interesting initiatives within the past number of years goes back to 2003. Again, some of you may be aware that at that time, the Department of Employment and Learning in Northern Ireland, together with a couple of other bodies, commissioned a major piece of comprehensive survey of demand for and provision of childcare in Northern Ireland. Now, that was in 2003. That was carried out by Dr. Anne Gray and Professor Irene Bruegel. And what they concluded was, quite boldly, that there was a significant shortfall in childcare places in Northern Ireland. They also found that the level of childcare provision in Northern Ireland was, quotes, much lower than in England. And they recommended a significant expansion in childcare, and specifically in the number of registered childminders to meet the demand. Now, it's worth perhaps just pausing at this point to say the survey that I'm going on to discuss in a minute doesn't focus exclusively on childminders, although it was commissioned by NICVA. Quite a lot of it is about childcare in general. But that recommendation on registered childminders and the concern that NICVA would express in terms of childminding is partly born out of the fact that childminding is actually it is the biggest sector within the childcare market within Northern Ireland. It's the most popular and indeed most affordable form of childcare. So, you know, purely if you look at it in academic research terms, it does make sense to look specifically, at least to some extent, at childminding. So 4 years after that original piece of research was done, in 2007, NICVA wanted to find out whether the gap between supply and demand that had been identified by Dr. Gray and Professor Bruegel still existed. It also wanted to find out how much interest the public had in childcare. Did they see it as an issue at all? Were they concerned? Did they think that the executive should be doing anything about it? And they also wanted to find out what the public actually thought about the quality of care provided by childminders vis-à-vis other forms of childcare. So what NICVA did was to commission a survey which was carried out by Ipsos Mori, and that questioned a representative sample of just over 1,000 adults throughout Northern Ireland. This survey involved the inclusion of a special series of special questions in Ipsos Mori's monthly Northern Ireland Omnibus survey, which incidentally covers other subjects as well. So there was no way that we were getting people who were exclusively interested in, or particularly interested in childcare. The survey was carried out through face-to-face interviews, and it took place in November and December 2007. And I suppose the most important thing about this particular survey, it was the first to examine public attitudes towards childcare in Northern Ireland. That had not been done before. So what we're going to look at first is what the survey revealed about the public's views on childcare policy. And as you'll see in a moment, the results, I think anyway, suggested greater concern about the issue of childcare among the general public than one might have anticipated. Respondents were asked for their view on the following statements, and this really follows on from the UK government commitment. The provision of good quality, affordable childcare for all who need it should be a priority for the Northern Ireland Executive. Well, more than 4/5 of respondents, 83%, said that they either agreed or strongly agreed with that particular statement. Indeed, nearly 2/5 strongly agreed with it. Moreover, and I think this is very important, the strength of support was almost as great among men as women, not quite. 80% of men agreed with the statement compared to 86% of women. Now, I think a lot of people would expect that the gap would have been greater between men and women on that particular question. There also, just so you can be aware of this, wasn't much difference in terms of the Protestant-Catholic breakdown on that particular question either. Not surprisingly, parents were especially supportive. Of parents with dependent children aged 14 or under, 91% agreed or strongly agreed with that particular statement. Now, I'm not going to put this up as a separate slide, but respondents were then asked more specifically whether addressing the shortage of childminders should be a priority for the executive. And there was a similar response there, with 81% agreeing or strongly agreeing that that should be a priority for the executive. And in fact there, 1/3 of all respondents, 33%, strongly agreed with that slightly more specific statement. So those were the public's views on sort of broad childcare policy, and we did ask them a few other more specific questions. You can come back to me on that later, but I'm not going to go into that now. There were a few other more specific questions on policy, which we can return to. But what sort of image do ordinary people, both parents and non-parents, have of different forms of childcare? Well, we looked here at two, and they're basically the two major forms of full-time childcare in Northern Ireland. That's childminding and day nurseries. Now, as nurseries tend to be more expensive than childminders, it might be assumed that people would see childminders as offering an inferior service. This also partly stems from the publicity, not so much in Northern Ireland, but in the UK press, particularly papers like the Daily Mail, which seem forever really to be running stories about recalcitrant childminders, you know, who allegedly have not looked after their charges properly. So there's certainly quite a bit of negative publicity, which of course, you know, Daily Mail and other papers like that, quite popular over here, people would see here. So I suppose those are really the two factors that might lead one to assume that childminders are going to have a pretty inferior image. Now, the results, as you can see there, do indicate that nurseries were seen in Northern Ireland as offering, more people saw them as offering a higher standard of care than childminders. But the difference in terms of the way that respondents perceived each type of provider isn't perhaps as great as might have been assumed. Basically, 45% of all respondents felt that the quality of care provided by childminders was good or very good. And that is, I don't know if I can do it with my finger here, but that's essentially, you're looking here at the kind of light purple and maroon colour here. So when it comes to, childminders, that's the sort of band that we're looking at. And that's compared to 53% who perceive the quality of care provided by... Sorry, right. You can't touch this thing without it, right. Right, okay, sorry, I do apologise for that. So there you've got your childminders sitting at 45% of people thinking that they provided a very good or good level of care compared to 53% with the nurseries. Only a very small proportion felt that the quality of care of either type of provider was poor. That's the, perhaps you can work it out from there. Again, it sort of looks, well, purple, I think. There's a little purple band there. And then if you look at the green band over to the right-hand side, that is the don't knows. And as you can see, there were quite a lot of don't knows, particularly when it comes to childminders. So I'm going to go on now to look at the responses just of parents within this, a subgroup of parents who had a dependent child aged 14 or under. If I can get back to this thing again. My mouse has disappeared, I think. 1 minute. Sorry?
Just click the return key or the enter key.
That one.
Yeah.
Right, okay. This was about a third of the whole samples, all parents. Not surprisingly, parents were less likely than the survey sample as a whole to say that they didn't know. You can see the green band over to the right is shorter, basically. And they were more likely to be positive in their view of both forms of childcare. But they were also more likely to say that they didn't know in terms of the quality of care provided by childminders. 26% said they didn't know, as compared to the quality of care provided by nurseries, where 20% of parents were saying that they didn't know. Now, although we're now getting down to quite small numbers, it is instructive to look at the comparative pattern of responses for the total sample of parents, that's the top band there, parents who were using childcare at the time of the survey, and parents who had sought childcare within the 3 years prior to the survey. And the sample sizes there are 318 for all parents, 118 for parents using childcare, and 95 for parents who had sought childcare. So the latter two groups, those bottom two bands, would have had direct experience of at least one type of childcare provider, whether formal or informal, and they may well have accessed information on more than one form of childcare. It's perhaps not surprising then that both these groups were more positive than parents as a whole about childminders about both childminders and nurseries, and less likely to say that they didn't know in terms of their quality of care. But there was a more marked difference in terms of the attitudes towards childminders and nurseries. So in other words, it was less likely that parents would say that they didn't know if they were either using childcare or they had sought childcare within the previous 3 years. Does that make sense? And when it comes to childminders, sorry, I need to show you the nursery slide as well. If you have a look at the don't knows for the bottom two bands there, you'll see that that is shorter than the other one. How do I get back now if I can't get my mouse? Sorry. Oh, wait a minute, I can get from my mouse here. Is that right? No, it's not. Is it? Yeah. So you can see that the don't knows is higher, but essentially, I'll just try and explain that again because I'm not sure I'm explaining myself very well here. Both the groups were more positive than parents as a whole about both childminders and nurseries. They were less likely to say that they didn't know, but there was a more marked difference in terms of attitudes towards childminders than towards nurseries. So if you look at this one here, and you look at the don't knows and the positive responses, compare the first band up here to the second two, and then you can see there's quite a big difference between the top band and the other two, right, the ones who actually had experience. Then if you go on to nurseries, you can see that the don't knows, there's less difference between all parents and the don't knows and the ones who are positive when it comes to those that had experience. Do you see what I mean? So having experience of childcare, if you're a parent, seems to mean you're more likely to feel that you do know something about childminders. You're positively inclined towards them than, whereas with nurseries, whether or not parents have had experience, they're still, more likely to feel that they know, more likely to be positive. Does that make sense? Because it's a rather complicated point, which I'm not putting very well, sorry. So that's perceptions of the quality of childminding and the quality of nurseries. Now, what I'm going to do is to move on to some of the questions in the survey which were asked only of parents. Parents were asked about their current use of childcare, and they were also asked about any experience that they had of looking for childcare in the 3 years prior to the survey. So who uses childcare? Well, nearly 2/5, that's 37% of parents, said that they made some use of either formal or informal childcare on either a full-time or a part-time basis. Now, you're probably thinking at the moment, but what does she mean by childcare, and what did the respondents think was meant by childcare? Well, that was actually fairly clearly defined to them. In the survey questionnaire, childcare was defined as care that was provided by any of the following types of individual or establishments which look after children while their parents work or study. And these were childminder, nursery, out-of-school club, creche, playgroup, nanny, au pair, friend or relative. In other words, what we do tend to think of as childcare, whether formally or informally provided. So it wasn't about, granny looking after little Tommy while mum pops to the shops for a couple of hours. It was meant to be childcare if parents were working or studying. And essentially 41% of working parents said that they made use of childcare, while 31% of non-working parents also accessed formal or informal childcare. So presumably that 31% should have been studying if they understood the question properly. You'll see that there is a difference in terms of social class, which is not at all surprising. And basically 44% of those in ABC1 category were making use of childcare compared to 32% of C2DE. So that gives you an idea of who is actually using childcare. But how easy did they find it to actually find childcare in the first place? Well, nearly a third, 30% of parents who said that they or their partner had looked for childcare in the previous 3 years, nearly a third said that they or their partner had looked for childcare in the previous 3 years. Of those who had looked for childcare, and we are down to a fairly small sample size here, we're down to 95, do bear that in mind. But of those who had looked for childcare, 30% said that their search had been fairly or very difficult, with 17% describing it as very difficult. On the other hand, 41% described their search as fairly easy, and 26% said that it was very easy. What isn't reflected in this particular diagram, but is pretty important, is that parents in rural areas who'd looked for childcare tended to find the search harder than those in urban areas. Again, probably no surprise there. 43% of rural respondents who'd looked for childcare described the search as difficult or unsuccessful, compared to 28% in urban areas. Now, as I said, it's got to be remembered that this particular subgroup was fairly small, and it's not necessarily representative of all parents as a whole. So you do have to exercise caution in interpreting these results. But they do suggest that childcare remains a significant problem for many parents, and also that access to childcare may well be more of a problem in rural areas. And I think in the absence of any other very recent survey data, we have to take this as a fairly useful indication. We then looked at what was important to parents when they look for childcare. Here we asked the question of all parents. They were basically asked to select from as many criteria as they wished from a list containing 4 options. And those 4 options were quality, cost, convenience, and that the person providing the care should be known to the child. Now, this last one was put in because we wanted to find out to what extent a preference existed essentially for informal care care provided by family and friends. Now, of course, known to the child could include, in some cases, a registered childminder who happens to know the family. But, you know, we still thought it would give a useful idea. And indeed, the two factors that were cited most frequently were quality and that care is provided by someone who knows the child. 52% of parents selected each of these options. Obviously here, people were allowed to choose more than one option if they wished. Convenience was cited by 27% and cost by 26%. And it's not up on this, oh sorry, it is up on this slide. You'll see here there's a class breakdown as well. And it is useful to look at the social class breakdown in terms of these factors. Essentially, the figures suggest a strong general preference amongst parents for informal care, with somewhat more importance being placed on whether the carer is known to the child among parents in the C2DE category. 55% thought that it was important in that category, compared to 47% of parents in the ABC1 category. But although those in the ABC1 category were more likely to place a high premium on quality than those in the C2DE group, as you can see, they were also slightly more likely to be concerned about cost. Cost was actually cited by 28% of ABC1 parents compared to 25% of C2DE. That may be because C2DE would tend more to use informal care, of course. So this question was asked of all parents, and these are the responses for all parents with children aged 14 or under. But in fact, if you do break it down to the childcare seekers and the childcare users, you find the same broad pattern. At the same time, those latter groups, the childcare users, the childcare seekers, were more likely to cite quality and slightly more likely to cite cost. So these statistics undoubtedly do show the importance that parents place on quality when it comes to childcare. At the same time, I think one does have to bear in mind that this is what people are saying, that, you know, ideally they like to feel that they place a premium on. And there is actually some UK-based research, which I think is cited in the research update, which has demonstrated that, not surprisingly, parents are actually limited by what they can afford. And in practice, there is a trade-off between quality and cost. Nevertheless, I think quite interesting, really, that so many parents do feel that quality is important. Then we went on to look at the preferred method of finding childcare. This, again, is all parents here. We asked them for just one here, one preferred method of finding childcare. And as you can see, by far the most favoured method was word-of-mouth recommendation from a friend or relative. Just under 3/4 of parents, 74%, said that they favoured that particular method. By stark contrast, much smaller proportions opted for the two more formal means by which childminders and indeed other child carers are able to promote themselves through organisations providing information on childminders like NICVA, or through ads in local papers or shops. As you can see, just 11% of parents said they prefer to find childcare through telephone contact with an organisation like NICVA, although it does get, what is it, something like 1,000 queries a month in busy months. Yep. So it is kept quite busy, actually. While a mere 4% said that they would prefer to search for childcare using ads. And the same pattern of responses was evident if you broke that down to parents using childcare or parents who had sought childcare. One of the most surprising findings, though, is perhaps the one that you can see at the bottom there, and that is the apparent lack of preference for using the internet. Because, in fact, most of the parents in the sample did have access to the internet. Just over 3/4 said they had access to the internet, with 74% able to access the internet at home. So they certainly got the means to do it, many of them. But a mere 1%, as you can see, said they would prefer to use the internet to search for childcare. Now, I don't see this as a reason for NICVA or any other organisation to abandon internet efforts, because, I mean, all the evidence suggests that we are becoming a more internet-dependent society. And so I think it's inevitable that the internet actually is going to become more important in terms of childcare. And also, I think it's worth remembering, we were asking people how they would prefer to find childcare, not necessarily how they actually did find it. So that's really some of the sort of key findings, if you like. Just to run through and highlight again some of those that I certainly feel are the most important. I would say, first of all, the fact that 83% of all respondents felt that the executive should be giving priority to the provision of good quality, affordable childcare. The fact that nearly a third of parents who'd recently looked for childcare said they had found their search fairly or very difficult, with those in rural areas finding it particularly difficult. The fact that more than half of all parents said the quality of care was important. The fact that day nurseries were viewed more favourably than childminders in terms of the quality of care that they're perceived as providing, but that there does appear to be, at the same time, less awareness of what childminders can actually offer. And the other two key points, I think, worth just reviewing. The fact that there was a strong preference amongst many parents for care provided by someone who knows the child, and very much sort of linked in with that, I think, the strong importance, the strong emphasis placed on word of mouth recommendations. So just to conclude, I think the results of this survey do suggest a greater concern about childcare amongst the general public than one might have expected. And particularly, I think it's notable that the proportion of men was not very much lower than the proportion of women on that particular issue. I think the difficulties in terms of childcare, I've said myself of finding childcare, as I've said, it's only a small sample there that we were looking at, but it's the best available, very recent research to go on at the moment. I think it really does suggest there's an urgent need for a comprehensive study, really, I think, repeating or doing something similar to what Gray and Bruegel did in 2003. And I think that really is how I would sum it up, that there's some very useful indicative data here when one looks at parents and childcare. But let's please see some more comprehensive and well-funded research very soon. Thank you.
I'm going to sit here rather than sit up there and share. I'm sure that's stimulated a lot of interest in the subject. It's obviously a subject that interests us all as professionals and also as parents. Do I need the mic?
Okay.
Okay. So can I open the audience now to questions and answers? I think we have about 20 minutes now before lunch is provided. So if you have any questions about any of the pieces of information provided, then I'm sure between us we'll be happy to answer those, or at least try to.
Just an observation. I was interested in the key findings. I don't think of a choice. Just in the key findings, I was interested that 48% didn't rate the quality of care as particularly important.
No, it wasn't really done. Oh, I see what you mean. Well,
I'm just extracting from the 52 who said...
Yes, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Yes, I suppose.
It's curious,
yes.
isn't it?
Yes, that's
I mean, they were friendly, helpful,
way
useful questions. It wasn't an interrogation. So it's just...
Yeah, no, I mean, that is, I suppose you could turn it round, yes, and say, yeah, I hadn't really thought of looking at it that way. Yes, I mean, you could say that it's surprising that more parents don't place a premium on quality, I suppose, if you look at it that way round. But I think it's just that, you know, it's sort of quality vis-a-vis cost and convenience. I mean, you know, and what people actually pick out of those. I mean, you could say, I suppose, as well, that, you know, something like 3/4 don't rate cost as being important, which, you know, also seems a bit unlikely. I suppose people were really picking what they felt to be the most important of those particular factors, and the fact that quality was cited, you know, double the number of times that cost was, does suggest, you know, that fair premium is placed on that. But I agree it could be interpreted in different ways, yes.
Would it be fair to say, a member said that they found the search for childcare difficult, that it's an imperative. Were presumably very few were unsuccessful in the end?
Well, essentially there were a few in rural areas, yes. There weren't any who were unsuccessful, in fact, in urban. It reported being unsuccessful in urban areas, but there were a few in rural areas. Out of that, I mean, it's a 95 sample, you know, so that has to be borne in mind. But I think the very fact that, you know, there were a few within that. I mean, certainly, you know, in terms of, work that I've done for NICVA and more on the qualitative side, and just in terms, I think, of NICVA's, the feedback that it would get, you know, there's more than one or two in practice in rural areas. I mean, you know, it is difficult because obviously the supply and the demand thing. I mean, in an urban area, I guess if you live in South Belfast and you're desperate for childcare, you could perhaps look at bits of East or West or whatever. Whereas, you know, if you're in Fermanagh in some fairly isolated place, you're pretty stuck, really. You know, so I mean, it's to that extent, I think it can be a bigger problem for parents, and you know, perhaps where it might just be very difficult, you know, because there's nobody in your immediate area in Belfast. It's actually if there's nobody in your immediate area in somewhere like Fermanagh, then you really are stuck.
We've just completed research in Conor McCarroll from South Armagh, Sure Start, South Armagh Childcare Consortium, and 80% of our out of the 605 people who surveyed do not access formal childcare, and they cited that there wasn't a service there, and they recognised that respondents that parents or grandparents as not being childcare, and over 54% didn't know that there was access to financial support for childcare. So we have the links that you have in your research matches a lot with what we found within our own.
But can you just explain a bit about the informal childcare? They don't see it as childcare, or they don't really,
they
right?
Don't recognise that as childcare. When we dive deep into the questionnaire, they said they don't know feel of childcare, and then the question then was who would they recommend to mind their children? A lot responded saying that their parents or relatives are minding their children, so they didn't recognise that as childcare.
Right.
I think in the rural, I mean, we found anecdotally, I think in rural areas that informal, you know, grandparents, close family are used an awful lot in terms of childcare, presumably because, well, obviously preference, but also because of the low numbers, the shortage of formal registered childcare that's out there.
And we're only 54% view of the tax credit, on the tax credit. And I think the problem there is relatives, like grandparents, accessing tax credit.
You can't.
And how do you regulate that childcare? Because there's a big proportion of 80% of our cities are getting family relatives. How do you regulate the care and the quality of care?
I think the whole issue with relatives being allowed to be registered and therefore eligible for childcare tax credits is one that we've raised as an organisation in the past. And I mean, I think a granny, for example, who would like to be registered and therefore eligible for a tax credit must be prepared to look after non-relative children. And I know that's an issue for registration and inspection in terms of their resources. So, you know, it is, I mean, it's a difficult one because a lot of families obviously want to make use of relatives and then cannot access the tax credits that are available.
And just one final point on this, sir, is that over half of our registered child members say that they would not actively promote childminding to other people.
The registered childminder wouldn't promote childminding.
Why
So
is
they're
that?
doing the profession, but they don't believe in it then?
Well,
Right.
suppose there's a whole lot of ways
Right,
to do
right.
that, but that's...
Right, that's an unusual finding, yeah.
Yeah. No, the registered child members is a small number of...
Yes, yeah,
There's a
yeah,
small number of
yeah,
child
I've
members.
seen that, yeah, yeah.
Registered child members, but half of them said they would not recommend childminding to others. So well, that's
As a career or as a form of childcare?
Ah, right, it's a career, right. Well,
But you've no idea what the reasons for that are.
well, bureaucracy and...
Oh, well, that
yeah,
ties in
yeah,
with it.
yeah, yeah,
Other-
yeah. No, some very interesting points there. I mean, I have just got a copy of your report and just had a quick look at it, so I think you're launching that fairly soon, aren't
The 19th.
you? Right.
Yeah, I mean, and NICVA did, and I mean, I assisted with this. We did do some research last year looking at new childminders and their experiences of registration, and there was certainly a major concern about, you know, the delays in getting registered. So perhaps that
Ties in,
helps
yeah,
to explain
yeah.
your findings
Yeah.
to some extent.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Any other questions?
Thanks, Liz. I just had a couple of points. One was, in your introduction today, you said that there might be differences between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom in terms of attitudes towards childminding. And I'm not really, or maybe I picked you up wrongly, but I'm not really sure why you thought there would be differences here, and whether or not the results that you've got actually show that we're more positive towards childminders here as opposed to the rest of the UK, or not. But maybe I picked you up wrongly in what you said.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to anyway quite say that. It's really about how child minding is portrayed in the media. Because in the UK tabloid press especially, they do quite often, every time basically that, you know, there is any case of a childminder and a child allegedly being mistreated in his or her care, you'll find newspapers like the Daily Mail, you know, really go big on that. And those papers are read over here, although, you know, they probably hold more influence in terms of public attitudes over there. So no, I wasn't trying to suggest there would necessarily be any difference. And as far as we're aware, that research, I mean, that question's just not been asked in any public opinion survey that we're aware of in England. So it'd be interesting to see how attitudes compare. But I suppose what I would say is that NICVA, certainly over the last couple of years, it has been doing quite a bit of positive media publicity around childminding. And there isn't really, it's kind of more regionalised in England. So you wouldn't really, in the UK national press, see the same sort of positive publicity emanating as much as it would here. So perhaps that helps to make a difference.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. The other point was just, I very quickly saw the news last night, and I wondered if your survey had picked up on anything. The news report I saw last night was something about selfish parents were the root of all even, but of course that came back down to working mothers. And I just wondered if your study had picked up on, you know, if you were looking at general attitudes towards childcare, if you had picked up any sense that women shouldn't be working outside the home and should be looking after their own children.
No, but then it wasn't a question that was asked.
No.
Yeah.
Any other question over there?
Yeah, I just want to ask about, was there any parents interviewed who had children with a learning disability?
It was, I mean, it was a public attitudes survey, so it just took a representative sample of, you know, the whole population,
Okay.
essentially.
Do you know if there's been any research done on sort of, you know, parents with regards to, you know, who have children with a learning disability and with regards to childcare?
We did do a very small study about 2 years ago, specifically focused on children with sort of mild to moderate disability. Sorry, I'm falling apart here. And it concluded really that the shortage of childcare and the difficulties that parents faced trying to access childcare for children with disabilities was really multiplied. You know, it was a very difficult thing for parents to actually access any form of childcare, and obviously the sort of stronger the disability got, the more difficult it got for parents. And we did make some recommendations within that research report that, you know, we needed to look at specialist childcare services and everything that went with that, such as training, support, funding and so on. But that hasn't progressed any at all. But it highlighted the real difficulties that parents faced when they had a child with a disability and were trying to find childcare.
Thanks very much. Victor Duclo from the Department for Employment and Learning. I was just a couple of questions really. One, I was interested in the first question that was asked and the results which demonstrate the high importance that the public place on the availability of childcare. And I was just wondering whether this study, or if you're aware of any others that have looked at how that perception of importance ranks alongside other public sector or you know, issues facing the public like health and education, or, you know, keeping the streets clean, and just whether that seems in relative terms very important or not so important compared to some of those other issues. I was interested in the cost finding as well, where you found that higher socioeconomic groups generally were more concerned about the cost of childcare than the lower socioeconomic groups. And you made the point, Liz, that maybe this is a reflection of lower socioeconomic groups making more use of informal childcare. I wonder, might it also be a reflection of the way funding regimes are being put in place, where they generally are more targeted towards people from the lower socioeconomic groups? And just one final point, really, to what extent are the results in this likely to remain valid even though we're in a difficult economic circumstance? We find ourselves in difficult economic circumstances at the minute. Do you think perceptions about childcare are changing as a result of the current downturn? Sorry, long-winded.
Right, okay. Well, to start with the first one, yes, I thought somebody would probably ask about the relative priorities. No, we didn't look at that, and I mean, that was largely really because we were just so constrained in terms of the number of questions that we could have in this bigger survey. But, I mean, I'm sure there's no doubt that, you know, especially at the moment, credit crunch and, you know, all sorts of other things might well come above childcare. I think really, you know, I would come back to the fact that if you looked at, you know, breakdowns in terms of, I think it was class, I mentioned men and women, you know, the Protestant Catholic thing. I mean, it did seem to be overall, you know, this sort of a level around about 83%, whatever way you broke down that group, which, you know, suggested to me, you know, I would have expected a figure maybe closer to about 70, 75%, with women perhaps at, you know, 85% and men much, much lower. And that's what I thought was surprising. So yes, I'm sure if you gave people, you know, sort of 10 policy options of things that the executive could do now, childcare might not be awfully far up that list. But I mean, there's no doubt there that, you know, both men and women and people right across a number of different sectors of society would really like the executive to be doing more. You know, they weren't forced to say that they strongly agreed or agreed. That, you know, they could say that they disagreed, and most chose not to, you know. So I think there is some significance within that. The second point, now I've forgotten the other 2 points, but sorry, the second one was around cost. Yes, I mean, this was, essentially this survey was carried out, I suppose, when the credit crunch really had hardly started biting at all, because we're going right back to November, December 2007, and it would be a very interesting exercise to carry the whole thing out now, and I'm sure cost may well figure a lot more prominently. Yeah, but I don't really think that one should read it, because it was, you know, it's about how people would like to see themselves, I suppose, as well, in terms of choosing childcare. And, you know, essentially, a lot of them would like a quality option, and a lot of them would like it to be somebody that their child knows. But, you know, no, I don't think it should be read as meaning cost is irrelevant. Clearly, it's far from.
Hiya, I'm Tane O'Kane from the Women's Support Network. I want to pick up on the comment about the similarities between men and women's attitudes. Was there any findings that were significantly different in terms of gender? And also, were you able to gauge whether parents were single parents or in a co-parenting situation?
Well, I mean, no, there were no really significant differences between men and women throughout. When it came to parents, I mean, some of the, you know, there would have been quite a lot of dads answering there about sort of looking for childcare or whatever, and they may have been reporting, the way that the whole thing was worded, they could have been reporting the experiences of their partner looking for childcare, you know. But so essentially, no, I mean, there were no sort of major differences that were discernible. In terms of single parents, we didn't look at, no, we didn't factor that separately, I'm afraid, no.
Thank you.
Any more questions? No? Okay, I think we're coming up to about 5 to 1, so just remains for me to thank everybody here today. I hope you've found the presentation and the information useful. There is some more